This series contains sexual references, adult themes, and depictions of violence. If these things are upsetting for you, please take care while you're listening.
From the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Bondi Badlands, proudly sponsored by ACON and Waverley Council. Episode 2, Death of a Barman.
John was happy-go-lucky. He certainly didn't have what I would call as the warning signs for someone that may have been suicidal.
And he had eyes that sparkled, that actually spoke to you as you were talking to him.
So there we have it, another gay man associated with Marks Park.
Welcome to Bondi Badlands, an investigation into a series of cliffside murders and mysterious disappearances in Sydney, Australia, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I'm Greg Callaghan, author and deputy editor of Good Weekend magazine and the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. It's almost 4 months to the day after Ross Warren's death, the hot, windy night of November 22nd, 1989, and Barman John Russell is enjoying a few beers with his best mate Dino at the Bondi Hotel, a large turreted wedding cake for building located opposite the golden sands of the iconic beach. John has a lot to celebrate on this night. He's quit his 2 part-time jobs as a maintenance worker at Rose Bay Public School and a local BP service station, having just inherited $100,000 from his maternal grandfather. He's sharing celebratory drinks, his first farewell to Bondi before the big move to his dad's property in Wollombi. The following Tuesday, John will celebrate his 32nd birthday at his dad's property. John's cousin, James Brooking, says that John was on top of the world at this time, but then John was always a positive person.
He was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and he had eyes that sparkled, that actually spoke to you as you were talking to him. He had a very vibrant personality. He was always there to do whatever he could for anyone. And he was very generous in his spirit, very generous in his heart, very generous in his giving. He believed that everybody was the same and there was no classifications, there was nothing. We were all just family or human beings or people just going through life. He's the type of fellow that when he walked into a room, his presence actually lit the room up, yet at the same time gave a calming effect. And you felt that when he spoke to you, you were the only one there.
John's father, Ted, described his older son as naturally upbeat, the kind of guy who had lots of friends.
He used to enjoy life, had a very big circle of friends and used to enjoy their company as well.
Johnny, as his family called him, grew up with his younger brother Peter in Bondi, where his grandfather, a pastry cook, had managed a cake shop, Cleck's Cakes, for decades. John and Peter became particularly close after their mother Pam died when John was about 12, according to their cousin, James Brooking.
The day that his mother died, well, actually what happened was I was at work and I got the phone call from the boys to say that they've gone in to wake their mother, but they couldn't wake her. And I said to ask them, I said, well, where's your grandfather? And they said, well, he's out at work and we can't contact him. So John said, they just said to me, could you come over? Can you come over? We don't know what to do. So my boss let me go and I went over to see them. And as soon as I walked in the bedroom, I knew that Pam had gone out during the night. And the strangest part with all that was when we went outside to wait for Uncle Alan to come home, and we just chatted and tried to console them and be with them. And Johnny said to me, it was very strange last night. He said, Mum came and took us and we went and sat out on the front step. And she talked to us for hours and hours. And she's never, ever, ever done that. And it was kind of a maturity in him where he said, I don't know whether Mum knew that this was going to happen. And then the other thing I noticed was Pam never, ever, ever removed her wedding ring. But when I went into the bedroom to check and see, her wedding ring was actually on the side table. So maybe John had something in his words there to say that she was more or less trying to prepare them.
John was a Bondi boy through and through and was well known and liked across the area, says James.
He loved the ocean and he loved the beach. There's just something about that kind of, I think, gave him peace, because sometimes we just go to these places just to sit and reflect, get something that we can't get from anywhere else. And I think Bondi and Bondi Beach was one of those places that no matter what was on his mind, and that maybe that was his solace, that he could go and know that he was with nature.
On the Saturday evening of June 24, 1978, John attended the first Mardi Gras parade, which was planned to mark the anniversary of the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969. What had begun as a festive, light-hearted march behind a truck blasting out Tom Robinson's Glad to be Gay swiftly turned ugly.
So try and sing if you're glad to be gay.
Police started arresting people and throwing them violently into paddy wagons. In all, 53 people were arrested that night, but luckily John had left before the violence started. John very much came of age as Sydney itself was coming of age as an international gay capital. In 1982, ABC TV's venerable Four Corners news program devoted an entire episode to this, called Sydney, Golden City of the Gays.
In New South Wales, as in most states, the homosexual act is still regarded as a serious crime. The difference is that in spite of the law, Sydney is rapidly becoming for gays the San Francisco of the Southern Hemisphere. Sydney has its own gay guidebook. It lists 61 homosexual groups and social clubs. There are some evenings when nearly everyone you see in this part of Oxford Street will be gay.
The growing demand for equality may have been a serious matter, but that didn't rule out having a bit of fun.
We want our freedom to do as we like. We don't want to be molested. We don't want to be contested. We don't want to be arrested. We just want our rights. Oh, we want our freedom. Oh, we want our freedom.
In 1984, homosexuality was decriminalised in New South Wales, and by 1989, Sydney had become one of the great gay meccas of the world. But by this time, the Bondi boy and long-time Oxford Street barman John was ready for a big tree change. He'd been working since he was a teenager, had helped raise his younger brother Peter's son Alan, who he was the second dad to after Peter's wife left him. Now, with $100,000 in his bank account from his grandfather, John was ready to start a new life. On the evening of November 22, after hours of chatting, the two old friends John and Dino finally call it a night. But as he's about to turn the corner to catch a bus back to Surrey Hills, where he lives, Dino notices John crossing the road to the beach, instead of taking a right back to the apartment he shares with his younger brother Peter. Who knows why John went to the Bondi headland that night? As far as we know, he wasn't a regular attendee of Beats and rarely walked the southern headland, especially at night. John passes the Bondi Icebergs Club, the pool where each winter a hardy band of swimming enthusiasts do laps among blocks of ice. John continues along the pathway, but he doesn't even get halfway to Mackenzie's Point, the middle of the headland, before he's surrounded by a group of young thugs in the twilight near the edge of the cliffs, which back then didn't have a railing.
G'day, mate. What's going on? Not much, mate. What are you doing? I want your wallet. You're kidding, aren't you, mate? No, mate. I'm not your dirty crook. You have here before I give you off. Log in.
The adrenaline coursing through John's veins, he tries to fight off his attackers. In the melee, he grabs the head of one of his assailants and pulls a small thatch of blonde hair out. Surrounded and hopelessly outnumbered, however, John is quickly overcome. The young thugs pick John up and hurl him, feet first, over the cliff.
I think he would have fought head and tail, whatever you want to call it, to survive and make sure that he wasn't going to be going over that cliff thinking that he could overcome that many people. I mean, it's hard enough to overcome one person, let alone when there's a group of them. They'd all be having a go. So it was just like a fait accompli for them. But I would say that he would fight right to the end until there was no strength left. But I think in that type of scenario, all the strength that he ever had and all the strength that he could ever gain would have been given to him, but it just wasn't enough.
One of the killers throws John's cigarette packet over the cliff after him, followed by a handful of loose coins John had had in his pocket, as he'd lost his wallet a week before. On the platform below, John lies unconscious but is still breathing. He takes his last breath about 45 minutes later.
The saddest thing is picturing John and seeing and knowing that his life was fully ahead of him, and yet he went primarily to say goodbye to the place he loved the most, probably thinking that he'd probably never get back there, and the ocean that he loved. And I kind of picture him just peering out towards the dark horizon, thinking to himself, this chapter of my life is now going to close, and tomorrow I'm going to start a new life, and the sun will come up and my life will go forward.
The following morning is hot and clear and a personal trainer is out for a brisk walk. He bounds down some stairs to the left of the pathway, half expecting to see some anglers. Instead, he sees a bloody body lying face down, his red pullover pulled up. He checks for signs of life. No pulse. This is the era before mobile phones, so he runs up to a block of apartments being renovated nearby and alerts a builder, who calls the police on his car phone. At 10:45 a.m, ambulance officers pronounce John dead. Officers from the Bondi police station arrive, take at least 30 crime scene photos of his body and bag the mysterious blonde hairs John is clutching in his left hand. They pick up a packet of cigarettes and find a National Australia Bank credit card tucked behind the foil. Unfortunately, the address attached to the credit card is John's grandfather's now empty house in Ocean Street, not the apartment he's been sharing with his brother and his nephew a couple of blocks away. So it takes the police some time to track his family down. In the meantime, they put John's bloodied red pullover and jeans on a mannequin outside the station, requesting any information as to his identity. That night, John's friends meet at the Waverley Legions Club for a friend who will never arrive. By this time, John's brother Peter knows something is terribly wrong. The next morning, Peter has only been at Double Bay Primary School, where he works as an ancillary assistant, for a matter of minutes before an officer approaches him in the playground. Within an hour, Peter is gazing down in shock at his brother's dead body at Glebe Morgue. The following day, John's father arrives at Peter's apartment in Bondi to pick up his elder son, whose luggage is piled up in the hallway. Peter didn't want to break the awful news to his father over the phone. Peter gave his dad a glass of water and asked him to sit down. "Dad, I'm afraid something terrible has happened to John," he said. Most of John's family and friends, those who knew him best, believed he was murdered. John's brother Peter was emphatic.
My first immediate reaction, and everybody I know's immediate reaction, was this isn't suicide.
John's entire family didn't for a moment believe John had committed suicide, including his cousin James.
Then you hear that they thought that it was suicide, and And you kind of dismiss that because you say that wouldn't be Johnny, regardless of anything, that wouldn't be Johnny because he already had started to make way for his new life and he had the facilities to do it. And with his personality and that, you just thought that's just got to be put aside.
Nor did James believe that John had drunkenly fallen off the cliff.
He did like his beer. Put it this way, I never saw him, on times that I did see him at family function, I never saw him drunk or anything like that. It was always social and enjoying himself and having a really good time.
Despite this, there was no formal investigation into John's death. The police report, dated February 16, 1990, noted that the area where John's body was found was a gay beat, that gangs had attacked homosexuals there, but bizarrely concluded there is no evidence to suggest there were any suspicious circumstances surrounding his death. Ted was handed a brown paper bag containing John's freshly laundered clothes, including the red jersey, gym shoes, and $4.60 in coins that were lying around his body. Although this was the era before DNA testing, the clothes could have been tested for blood type and the fibres of any of his assailants. The first inquest into John's death, held in July 1990, lasted just 35 minutes and stamped the case unsolved, with no clues to his death. Death by misadventure, they called it, consigning the young man's memory to that uncertain catch-all that usually means accidental death. Peter Russell strode out of the courtroom in disbelief. He didn't hear from the police again for another decade, until the new millennium.
As time moves, they say it heals, but it doesn't. All time does is just make it a little bit variable. Because once somebody's in your heart and you love them dearly, they never leave it. And when they go, sometimes a bit of you go with them. And especially in a situation like this, you can actually feel yourself going over the cliff with him.
It's the winter of 2000, and Detective Sergeant Steve Page's preliminary investigations into the disappearance of newsreader Ross Warren have led him to the suspicious death of another man just over 4 months later, of Barman John Russell. He's now running an investigation into the murders called Operation Taradale and is assembling a small team of detectives. While studying the crime scene photographs and police report into the death of John Russell, he realises with a thunderbolt that he's met John's father, Ted.
In 1994, I worked on an investigation for the coroner looking at the bushfires that we had, so a large coronial inquiry in relation to that. And I spent some time with a captain of the Wallumbye Rural Fire Service, and his name was Ted Russell. You know, I had that horrible feeling that I think I knew what happened there. And I remember having a beer with Ted, in '94 at his house, had a barbecue. I asked him about himself, and I said, well, tell us about your family. And he said, well, there's me, I've got my partner and 2 sons. One's died. He died at Bondi a number of years ago. Yeah, again, I didn't delve into that at the time, but certainly when I rang Ted and reintroduced myself to him in 2000 and just asked that question, I was able to quickly work out that Ted was John's dad, and that was the story he was telling me many years before.
Ted and Paige had a long, serious chat on the phone.
Ted was quite relieved that I'd touched base with him in relation to this. He said, we never believed it was accident or suicide. We always knew he was killed, and he was thankful that I was having a look at that also. John was happy-go-lucky. He certainly didn't have what I would call as the warning signs for someone that may have been suicidal. He certainly had a lot going for him in his life.
Studying the crime scene photographs closely, Paige noticed the tufts of blonde hair in John's hand, likely belonging to John's killer. So Paige set about trying to source them from the crime scene archives. DNA from an exhibit like human hair is as good as a fingerprint and compelling evidence in a court of law. But the plastic envelope containing the hairs was missing from the case envelope.
When you've got crucial forensic evidence, like hairs, that just go missing, it was frustrated is probably the best way that you could describe it. And certainly, if we responded to it better as a police force back in 1989, we'd probably be having a different conversation.
Even in the pre-DNA testing era, tests could have been done.
In the current world, you're looking at trying to get DNA from hair, but back then in 1989, we just didn't have that technology back then. But as long as you had the root of the hair, you could do tests and work out a blood group and that kind of thing to work out some features of the owner. Whilst it wasn't rolled out, back in that era, we knew it was coming. So it was talk of the town, that emerging ability to test for DNA.
After talking with Ted, Page was also dismayed that John's clothes had been used as an exhibit outside the police station and later laundered.
It's not unusual to replicate a scene or event, but to use that original clothing rather than to actually preserve it as an exhibit, looking back at it with 20/20 hindsight, was flawed. And Ted got the clothing back, but it was dry cleaned somewhere along the way. So any evidence that would have been on that was lost.
Page realised he required some new, compelling evidence.
What I needed was witnesses, and what I needed was evidence. There was none before me, so I had to kind of make my own luck.
Page came up with the idea of a reenactment of John Russell's fall from the cliffs to the rocks below, and invited Sydney's major TV programs and newspapers to the event. A dummy with the same weight and height of John and dressed similarly to him at the time was thrown off the cliff in the same spot John went over. The reenactment, held on a grey, overcast day at Bondi, drew the major television networks, including Channel 9 and this report by reporter Nina Stevens.
It's like an unclosed chapter of a book.
Police renewed their investigations this year and today staged a reenactment of Mr Russell's death, pushing a dummy over the cliff several times to gauge if the 31-year-old fell or was pushed. Also crucial to the inquiry, DNA testing on hair found in Mr Russell's hand.
It could well identify the offender.
Mr Russell had just discovered he was to receive a large inheritance. The body of 25-year-old Mr Warren has never been found. Even though the two men didn't know each other, police believe they were both the target of gay hate crimes, possibly carried out by a sole attacker or even a gang.
I would imagine many people would now feel a lot more comfortable coming forward without any fear whatsoever and with a lot of confidence in police, and that makes now the time.
So we go through the motions of, measuring how far out, it landed from the cliff, etc., and the positioning of the dummy, but it certainly didn't replicate the falling of a person, and that was never our intention. Our intention was just to create a newsworthy event.
Page had been suspicious about the position of John's head in the crime scene photographs from the moment he saw them. If John had accidentally fallen head first off the edge of the cliff, wouldn't his head be facing out to sea? Instead, it was facing in the opposite direction, towards the headland. Page contacted Dr. Alan Carler at the New South Wales Institute of Forensic Medicine, who in an 8-page report concluded that if he'd acted alone, John would have had to twist his body 180 degrees to rest in the position depicted in the photos. Dr. Carler also noted that John's red jersey, pulled back to expose the back and lower abdomen, suggested it had been pulled back by another person prior to the fall. There are some injuries to the face and hands, Carla noted, which are suggestive of an assault. Page's head began to spin when he read the final words of the report. The possibility exists, Carla concluded, that this man met with foul play and might have been forcibly thrown off the cliff. The reenactment of John's fall created ongoing media interest for months after the event. Page was contacted by a number of individuals keen to give testimony, but a couple stood out, one of whom was a phone call from a French man.
I still remember the phone call that I got after the reenactment. I certainly wasn't expecting it. There was another body that I had to investigate, and that was the death of Gil Mataney. So his then partner, Jacques Musi, just said, "Look, I saw the news. I need to tell you that My partner went missing in 1985. We were living in Bondi, and he was gay. He was of the habit of a night to get his Sony Walkman and go for a walk, and often through Marks Park just to stretch his legs. So there we have it, another gay man associated with Marks Park.
So Page now had a new murder investigation on his hands, 4 years before the killings of Ross Warren and John Russell. In the meantime, Page was also poring over the crime scene photographs and court transcripts of another murder on the headland in July 1990, almost a year to the day after Ross Warren disappeared, and 6 months after John Russell's body was found at the bottom of the cliffs. It was of a Thai man, Critchacorn Ratana Jarathaporn, who was bashed to death on the headland and whose body was later found underwater at the base of Mackenzie's Point. But in this case, the murder was investigated by Waverley Police, not Bondi Police, and the killers were sent to prison. Page winced as he pored over the crime scene photographs. These butchers, he concluded, took a mindless pleasure in torturing Critchacorn, prolonging his pain as long as possible, an insight into the nightmare that would have also engulfed Ross Warren and John Russell. Which is why Page was keen on investigating any possible links between Critchacorn's killers and those who murdered Ross Warren and John Russell.
Next time on Bondi Badlands.
Most particularly, I recall with Critchacorn and I, there was something about the vulnerability and the thought that someone from Thailand had come here, maybe not as aware of the dangers.
They bashed him for being gay, and they raped him as well. I just don't get that. You're abusing him for being involved in, male-on-male sexual relationships, but then you have sex with him yourself.
There were terms like the gay plague and gay cancer appearing every day in mainstream media outlets that really created a huge amount of stigma and discrimination that was targeted towards our community.
Bondi Badlands is sponsored by Waverley Council and ACON, a New South Wales-based health promotion organisation specialising in community health, inclusion and HIV responses for people of diverse sexualities and genders. Our thanks to podcast guests James Brooking and Stephen Page. Special thanks to Michael Atkinson, formerly of ACON. Bondi Badlands is based on the book of the same name by Greg Callaghan, who narrates the podcast. Original theme and podcast production by Ian Cuthbertson. Extracts from Crime Investigation Australia's Bloodsport, The Bondi Gay Murders, and the ABC Four Corners program Sydney, Golden City of the Gays, used with permission. If this podcast has raised issues for you, contact Lifeline on 131114 or Beyond Blue on 1300 224636.